Dear Dr. Sabet, thank you for agreeing to join this informal interview. I envisage this as an experimental space where we can throw ideas of each other, even wild and crazy ones, precisely because we are simply testing ideas out. To be able to discuss freely, I propose we reserve the option to at any time radically revise any ideas expressed. This spirit of dialogue is very common within academic spaces, but I think we can easily adopt it here as well. You have worked on problems of curriculum, particularly from the perspective of the integration of knowledge, since at least the mid-80s. Your dissertation from 1987 with the State University of New York at Buffalo was in this area. You then took this topic further in a paper from 2000 entitled Integrative Approach to Knowledge and Action, a Baha'i Perspective, which has resulted in a larger manuscript which has never been published. While you were having an academic career in the United States, you were also involved in revising the overall curriculum of at least two Baha'i or Baha'i-inspired institutions, translating some of these ideas into practice. I think one of the ideas you have been working on is that the current challenges of civilization derive from a huge imbalance in our modern system of knowledge. Such a view implies that the modern system of knowledge could be rebalanced or recalibrated in certain ways to meet the global challenges facing us. In what follows, I want us to discuss the topic of the social sciences while mindful of this larger perspective of the imbalance in our modern system of knowledge. Is there a crisis in the social sciences that plays into this? Could we rebalance the modern system of knowledge by addressing that? So this would be the more general question that I have. I then also have a more particular question. I am especially curious as to how you have represented the social sciences within the diagram summarizing your conception of the curriculum. I'm going to share this diagram. It's going to take a little bit.
Yes.
I am in particular curious as to how you have represented the social sciences within this diagram. In this diagram, the social sciences appear as arrows cutting across four main domains of knowledge: the humanities, natural or physical sciences, technology and applied sciences, and areas relating to the issue of an emerging world order, such as political economy, policy, law, business, and so on. So the particular question here would be, why have you represented the social sciences in this way, as this is not something I have seen before. But you can start. Well, you can start anywhere you want. And these are like just kind of angles I'm curious about. But the discussion of social sciences can start from anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an excellent opportunity, and I'm very glad to talk with you and for classes that we had and all the good experiences and memories that we have in the past. I think this is a very significant topic, the concept of social sciences or whether social sciences are in crisis. And let me say a few words in the beginning about the significance of this topic, and then a brief introduction about what do we mean by social sciences and what is the position of social sciences within the broader scheme of knowledge or cognition or basically epistemology. I think this is a significant topic even though some people may think in the beginning, or those who are not involved in this discourse, that so what is the significance of discussing social sciences while we have so many other problems in the world? I think this is very important because as you hinted, it is what we are trying to discuss is not just the social sciences, but whether there is some sort of harmonious understanding of knowledge, or is there any unity of cognition, unity of understanding? Because perhaps when we say unity of understanding, which is obviously lacking in the world today, that unity of understanding perhaps could be expanded into some sort of disagreement on what are the values and contributions of social sciences and how they can improve world situation, how they can improve to human understanding, to world peace, to global interactions, and so on. So therefore, as you see, it is a very important topic. It covers, in a sense, the relationship between science and religion, in a sense. It also covers the relationship, the necessary relationships between culture and material life, between values and meanings and the material aspect of existence. So it covers all of these areas. Now, what are basically what do we mean by social sciences? Social sciences, I mean, of course, the study of human behavior, collective action, collective behavior is not a new subject. It goes back to ancient times. Even, older philosophers have discussed this. Plato, Aristotle, Eastern philosophers, they all have discussed issues of governance, issues of ethics, which are aspects of social sciences. But what is, or for instance, Ibn Khaldun was one of the earliest thinkers or philosophers that discussed the evolution of history and the reason for the fall of civilizations and so on. So therefore, it is not a new subject in that sense. However, until modern times, social sciences were a part or an aspect of philosophy and theology. In other words, it was discussed within the theological and philosophical discourse. However, with the emergence of modern times, basically with some fundamental developments in Europe, which can be, come under the umbrella of modernity and modern times, and developments and changes that took place in physical and natural sciences or material sciences that revolutionized human understanding, revolutionized the church-based concept of cosmology, and opened up a new understanding about how to view the world based on testing and measurement and experimentation and so on. So this revolution, this scientific revolution that took place within astronomy and physical sciences, biology, and so on, gradually impacted the development of social sciences later. So basically what we can say is that by the age of so Enlightenment, basically we are talking about 17th, 18th century, and with the contributions of individuals such as Descartes and John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu, and many others, gradually the concept of social sciences started to evolve as independent fields of study, separated from their previous theological and philosophical background. For instance, Auguste Comte, which is famous for being the father of sociology, perhaps the mother of all sciences, social sciences, started a new conception of a new understanding, a new approach to the study of society and social behaviors and explanations of that. And actually, he called it the queen of all sciences, because it is a science that deals with values and meanings and very complex aspects of human life. So, and then this development resulted in basically in the 20th century in the complete formation and conceptualization of diverse fields of studies or discipline under sociology, political science, psychology. In psychology, for instance, those earlier advocates of behaviorism try to approach a scientific way of studying human mind and human behavior. And then, of course, in psychoanalysis, Freud opened up a new understanding to human psyche and so on. So gradually, these new developments formed a new understanding of social sciences. So basically, if we use Comte's understanding of categorization or organization of knowledge, first we have begin with physical sciences, perhaps with physics, which is the mother of all physical and natural sciences, and then we come up to the level of chemistry, and then of course to the level of biology or biological sciences. And then at that, from moving from biology to psychology, something profound happens. And that is the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of values, ethics, meanings, and so on. So that is basically the line that separates social sciences from physical and natural sciences. However, as I said, they interact with each other. And in 19th century and early 20th century, some scientists and philosophers and thinkers tried to use the methods of natural sciences and experimentation and bringing it into the domain of social sciences. So therefore, we have now, like in research, for instance, we use those methods to some extent to understand social sciences with further objectivity, because the essence of social sciences is subjectivity, and it is not that open and welcoming pure experimentation and testing and measurement. Therefore, they are using, let's say, for instance, adding some scientific dimension to qualitative research, which is used in social sciences, and also try to use quantitative research in order to quantify the results of findings in social sciences. And then, of course, using statistics and other methods to add more scientific dimension to the study of social sciences. So with this background, we realize that there is something that we need, humanity, so scientists, in general, we need to resolve. and that is how to approach the subjectivity, the value-oriented, and the meanings that are inherent in social sciences. That is the main question. And your reference to crisis of social sciences was, I think, goes back to this fundamental question: how we can approach the subjectivity of social sciences. And my understanding is that modern social sciences have tried to resolve this issue, but they have not been that successful. For instance, in psychology. And before I say further ideas on this, in this discussion, we are not trying to belittle social sciences as they are practiced today. This is just the objective observations, or trying to really discuss some of the issues and challenges, not just saying that they have no value. So let me be clear about that. Now, going back to psychology, for instance, psychology is about human behavior. I mean, individual behavior in mind, human understanding, and human values. And still, the question of consciousness is a taboo in some schools of psychology. And the question is, and at best they say this has nothing to do with psychology. We are not going to deal with it because it's complicated. It's more philosophical. It's more about religion and theology. And therefore, we just set it aside, the question of what is consciousness, what is the source of consciousness, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think this is not really a true answer to this fundamental question. We cannot ignore it. We cannot just transfer it to the domain of older domain of theology and philosophy, and or to individual preferences and so on. And in so many ways, people try to escape this question. And there are some psychologists also who have tried to answer this question by means of, again, scientific approach. And then, of course, we have atheistic philosophies or psychologists who have completely disregarded the question of consciousness as and basically its subjectivity. And even if they accepted the subjectivity of human consciousness, they have tried to define it within a materialistic frame of reference. Now, these are all very profound issues, and we can't discuss all of these because each particular aspect of this topic requires hours and all sorts of discussions and so on. But I'm just trying to briefly explain what is happening now. In other words, what is the current approach to let's say modern social sciences, and the fundamental questions such as subjectivity, consciousness, values, meanings, ethics, and so on, metaphysical issues, and so on. It's either ignoring it or referring to or using a materialistic philosophical framework. And I have to also mention something which is positive in a sense from my perspective, and that is, with the rise of modern social sciences, since 1940s, 50s, 60s, there were some new approaches, I should say newer approaches to this challenge that I just mentioned. And that is some social scientists or psychologists or sociologists try to disassociate themselves from the materialistic perspective of social sciences and offering new ideas. For instance, in psychology, Carl Jung, who was a student of Freud, and yet he came up with a new understanding, or tried to at least explain a new understanding of the field of psychology. And then there were other psychologists like Maslow and many others who tried to come with the idea of human potential. They did not come up, directly to say that, let's say, for instance, human beings have a soul, or there is something like that. They just said there are potentialities in every human being. Human being is not like a blank tablet, like earlier behaviorists, that you can write anything on it and you can shape it in any way you want. So they came up with the idea of human potential and the need for humanity, for human to develop ideas and reach a higher level of understanding and moral values and so on, which is, I think, another trend in the development of social sciences in the second half of the 20th century, I should say. And also, like, there are a number of individuals, like Peter Alexandrovich Sorokin in sociology, actually the father of modern psychology in American academic disciplines, who came from Russia to the United States, established the first department of sociology at Harvard. He came up with a totally a sociology that was profoundly different from earlier materialistic approaches to the field of sociology, and historians and many others who came up with different approaches to the study of human sociology and history. A study of history became a very crucial aspect. I mean, what are the forces or philosophy of history? Is there a direction in the development of historical evolution? So all of this, and then of course the question of materialism, materialistic philosophies that dominated the social sciences in the 20th century. That is also another significant idea in the development of these sciences. For instance, I just mentioned two. For instance, Karl Marx, and with the idea of Marxism and Marxist philosophy to explain social development and historical development was a complete form of materialistic interpretation of human society and social history. And then, of course, that gave, somehow the concept of historical materialism that Marx used was somehow different from mechanistic materialism of earlier times. As if Marx gave some life to material existence. It's a very interesting topic to just discuss it and think about it, and that became a powerful force for Marxian interpretation of history and social development. And then, of course, we had the concept of evolution, Darwinian evolution, which which was really a very profound development in biology. And then, of course, the way that it was, used in social sciences. Sometimes it was called social Darwinism, and people tried really to apply principles of natural theory into human behavior and social values and so on. So these are some of the philosophies, I should say, that or purely scientific understanding, because I'm not putting Darwin with Marx next to each other, because Marxian was a philosophy, Darwinian theory was essentially a scientific development in the field of biology. However, materialistic interpretation of Darwinian theory, and the way that even, we all know that even Darwin himself considered issues of ethics somehow beyond the, natural evolution and so on. So, but again, these are two examples that come to my mind as forces that have influenced the development of social sciences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me try to ask you questions. I'm curious. So when we speak about the social sciences, on the one hand, there is an argument that they've been influenced by the natural sciences. And then there is an argument that they've been influenced by materialistic philosophies. So already from the very beginning, we see this double direction. So they can get influenced by the natural sciences, or they can get influenced by the domain of philosophy. I'm wondering how the picture changes after the 1960s and 1970s. Because I can think, for example, of a number of turns, like the linguistic turn and the cultural turn in the 60s and 70s and maybe 80s. And then in more recent times, there's a discussion of a number of turns, although it is not very clear which ones will be significant long term, such as the affective turn, the ontological turn, neurological turn, and computational turn, so relating to computation. And in some of those dimensions, you can argue, for example, in the cultural turn, you can argue that the humanities and mostly philosophy really started shaping the social sciences. And in more recent times, you can argue that maybe life sciences and biology are, on the one hand, approaching the humanities, but also for example, for subdisciplines like bioethics. But on the other hand, they are also generating or implicating social science through things like Earth system science. So there are arguments attempting to put forward the idea that there is a convergence between the social sciences and science, and between the humanities and science, and it is dispelling, in a sense, some foundational principles of the humanities, such as that, for example, the human being has a special status because of reason and agency. Why do they do that? Because they uncover the human species as coexisting with other species, all implicating each other. So the progress of the human species depends on how we interact with the other species. Because in the field of cognitive biology, there is a discussion of how cognition applies to not only to species that have a nervous system, but even beyond to plants and microorganisms, and not only to living things, but also to technical systems. So even when we talk about AI, that would be one example of a technical system that displays cognition that in some aspects is more powerful than human cognition. And all of those things decenter this idea that there's something special, unique about human beings, which was kind of a faith related idea that we are the center of the universe and consciousness is reasoning, and values are not values, emotions are what make us special. But on the other hand, there's other complications coming into the picture. So what I'm trying to say is wonder how that picture and that story that you've told us looks more in the present, and whether, you know, are we saying, for example, that cognitive biology, looking at cognition across all these domains, still doesn't touch the discussion of consciousness and therefore is outside of it? Or are we seeing some really significant shift in there? And I appreciate this. Everything is very complex, and the discussion is it requires an insight that I do not claim to have in any measure. Thank you.
Thank you. As you mentioned, this is like, the examples that you mentioned, developments that you discussed, are aspects of this evolving and changing discourse. And in a sense, it is very positive because we are not advocating a particular orthodoxy. We are not saying that social sciences be superimposed by some sort of universal orthodoxy. So these evolution and these changes are good and necessary. Just a few items that crossed my mind as you were speaking. One was that going back to to that organization of sciences, as we just said, first we have natural, physical, and natural sciences that start with physics and the way that physics looks at the entire universe. And because of that, in my understanding, physics has a very unique approach or unique capacity to unravel, to disclose the mysteries of the universe. And therefore, what is happening in the field of physics, or what has happened with particularly with two significant theories. One is Einstein theory of relativity and quantum physics. They truly revolutionized human understanding of their environment, and not only that, the nature of reality. I can add something here. It has impacted philosophical, ideas that subsequently emerged as a result of these scientific developments in physics. went much further than what happened, let's say, in the field of biology. In other words, biology, even though there have been some progress, very interesting progress in the field of biology. Actually, I recently wrote a brief paper, and if anybody is interested, it's on academia.edu. It's about basically a summary of what has happened to the concept of natural selection. And then, of course, because of my Baha'i background, I have tried to give a perspective on that too. Anyway, so there have been profound changes in the field of biology and the idea of evolution, but I really want to emphasize what has happened in the field of physics, and I think based on a good many, not all, good many number of physicists, scientists who have basically declared that the traditional, crude, materialistic perspective of the 19th century is gone, based on the findings of these developments, these scientific developments. We are not dealing with a mechanical cosmology anymore. We are dealing with a cosmology that is unpredictable, constantly evolving, and in fact opens room for the role of human consciousness, and the way that human mind can influence the course of natural or physical events. So that is a very profound thing. And so one thing that I wanted among the ideas that you mentioned was this development, which really needs further discussion, further investigation, research, and so on. The other thing that crossed my mind was, after, we have social sciences, and then we have natural and physical sciences. But in between, we have to open a space. And that space is sometimes, there have been different names for that. But I use the traditional concept of applied sciences. That is like engineering, medicine, and basically the entire technology, the technology that has evolved humanity from the living in the caves to AI and traveling to the space technology. Now, this technology and this applied domain, which is between, is like a sandwich between social sciences and physical sciences, is very significant because it receives impact and data and information from both. It uses modern disciplines such as biology and physical sciences, but at the same time, it requires values and meanings to give shape to the direction of this technology, to give a purpose to why an engineer makes something, or why basically we have this advanced modern life. It needs some direction from the above, from the domain of values and meanings, to determine the course of history and avoiding catastrophic consequences. as a result of, let's say, nuclear bomb. Because what comes from natural and physical sciences uh, are essential for making technology and technological improvement, to discoveries, to inventions. But at the same time, we need contribution from so for now, I should say social sciences, to provide that ethical and value-oriented framework for this. So, and you see how these two domains, natural sciences and social sciences, come together, or essentially must come together, in order to determine the outcome of the technology and technological progress. Late Edward Wilson, famous biologist, who was not really a spiritualist, or he was, in a sense, a kind of, I don't know, not necessarily a religious person, but he was strongly emphasizing the need for this coming together, and for the sake of humanity, for the sake of our future. So that's my understanding of that.
I'd like to continue that discussion about technology and talk about maybe computation, because I think we can almost say that to at least some extent, the domain of technology is reshaping, reinterpreting both part of the social sciences and the humanities. And it does so because running statistical inference and computation on all the data from those domains of knowledge, and even kind of forcing that method being adopted in those spaces and disciplines. And the interesting question, so I guess some examples would be, for example, to uh, when you create AI models, they need to predict or understand uh, the human choices, let's say, or they need to be able to see. How do you create something that sees like a human, or hears like a human, or classifies things like a human, or decides like a human? So the question of what is decision making in humans is it becomes the question of what is knowledge, and suddenly you need to have a model for what knowledge is, from the AI computational technology perspective, and then you start working on problems of philosophy with direct application. And to some extent, this starts displacing philosophy and creates some kind of unusual tension. And the same goes to all the other dimensions. And the question of what values or meanings are embedded through this process is a matter of intense discussion. But there are really positive things and there are really negative things that come through it. The positive things are that there are some discoveries and some advances on understanding uh, human behavior, and maybe even levels of the unconscious. Uh, on the negative side, there's often a sort of, especially when applied to education, there's often a sort of assumption that the mind is a blank slate. So there is a tendency towards a new kind of behaviorism, and some, like Achille Membe, have raised the point that there's two big dangers there. One is that he sees these new technologies and the new media forms as a sort of infrastructure for the unconscious. And while before the unconscious was not really mined by our forms of knowledge, it was relatively taboo. Now it has become a domain being mined with technologies that we don't fully understand in terms of what the capacity is to produce results. And this lifts all the taboos about the unconscious, and it does so in the context of the market. So it does so in the context of knowledge has to be knowledge that produces gain for agents in the market. And also in the context in which the division of knowledge shifts from the public domain of higher education, for example, to the private domain of big corporations and companies because of the funds necessitated and the energy to run huge computational modeling. So there's, in a sense, there's both pros and cons to this, but there's also a sort of I don't want to say convergence, but definitely some kind of overlapping between the different domains of knowledge that we kind of discuss as separate. Ethics of AI is a huge field that is in development. So that's the relation with the humanities. There's all sorts of applications to social sciences, and the social sciences themselves are being reconfigured in terms of computational methods, maybe too much so. So the question, I guess the question I want to turn back to is where does the realm of values and meanings, where is it situated? Where should it be situated in all this discussion? And
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
and just to throw it a bit further, suppose we see religion as part of the humanities, which I think is a very correct view in my, at least for now, for me. Uh, could we say that maybe the humanities is a counterbalancing point for the computational age and the problems I've just mentioned with the infrastructures of the unconscious, because the humanities themselves deal with creative imagination and the unconscious, and therefore there is that role that maybe we have neglected in the more material phases of our sciences. Maybe that particular domain should be given more support because it is counterbalancing and aiding whatever happens in the computational field.
Thank you very much. You see, this issue of artificial intelligence and all the surrounding discussion about this is very fascinating. And of course, I'm not really an expert in that area, but and you have to realize it is an evolving, rapidly evolving, exponentially evolving process with kind of unpredictable outcome. That's for sure. And there are people who warn us about potential negative or sometimes even tragic consequences that if artificial intelligence grow and basically dominate human mind and human control us, which is, again, I think could be a possibility. I just share my own understanding. And my understanding is that we have to put this in the context of the evolution of technology in In other words, look at it with a historical perspective. I think artificial intelligence is nothing but the evolution that started with creation of fire, or the first human being who used stones or woods or heavier stuff to defend themselves, to go hunting. In other words, tool making. It is the evolution of tool making. And then throughout history, we established, created, discovered agriculture, printing, and all of these developments in the history of technological life, they first posed significant challenges, perhaps, but overall, they improved human life. So in that sense, I'm very pro technology. My understanding is that we have to welcome technology. It's part of life. I don't believe in this idea that technology has ruined our lives, or we have to go back to very, very basic technological evolution in order to find peace of mind. I don't think so. Technology has brought civilization, and we are now have established the foundation of some sort of global understanding of our needs for each other, and realizing the potential that integration of people and cultures and nations and their collaboration and cooperation can result in profound changes of life and our understanding of the purpose of life and why we are here, and in all of those. And technology has been significant in doing that. Let's put it this way. In history, in literature, for instance, we have had ideas in most cultures somehow about references to humanity rather than to a particular nation or region or culture or race. So you can see some examples of reference to totality of human life, to that all human beings are part of one family and so on. But we never had a chance to experience this as today, when borders and all these artificial differences are disappearing in a sense, and through communication, through transportation, through all these means, we now can touch the concept of oneness of humanity. We can touch it, literally touch it. And this could not be possible without technological development, without technological progress. So within this broader context, with a background idea of how history has played this and shaped this, I'm very positive. I have a positive outlook about artificial intelligence, while acknowledging its potential consequences and difficulties that we may experience at different levels. But overall, it is a very positive development. Now, my understanding is that, in the past, all those technological developments helped us, in a sense, to strengthen our inner qualities. But artificial intelligence is unique in a sense that it is helping us in terms of our mind, in terms of our reasoning, in terms of our consciousness, which is very unique. And actually the danger also exists in that uniqueness. But so therefore, my understanding is that we need a new, let's go back to the concept of social sciences. We need to develop values and meanings and ethical frameworks and a higher purpose, a transcendental purpose for human life in order to deal with the challenges of artificial intelligence and use its contributions for the advancement of humanity. In other words, artificial intelligence reflects who we are. It is like a mirror in front of us. In that mirror, we can see good and evil. Let's put it in that context. If that is the case, then artificial intelligence reflects that too. It comes back to us with good and evil. But if we try to look at it and shape it and frame it into a transcendental framework that is about human dignity and all those things, then in return, artificial intelligence returns back to us to enhance that human dignity and integrity and transcendental understanding. And it helps us, like these days I hear in medicine, for instance, physicians are doing things that they couldn't do. And in fact, the accuracy of artificial intelligence in determining certain, tests and blood tests and X-ray and this and that, with more precise understanding of a combined physicians come together. And I think this will enhance, it will improve, and perhaps in the future, some people are afraid that we are going to lose some jobs. That is definitely the case. But we have to see that not as a challenge, because we have a current economic framework, and within that current economic framework, we try to say, oh, we are losing jobs. But we have to think about an emerging economic framework in light of the challenges that artificial intelligence is bringing to us. So it requires constant evolutionary thinking, not in terms of just one area or that area, but the totality of life, totality of collective life must be re-evaluated, reframed in light of the challenges that we are going to face with, let's say, artificial intelligence. And there are, of course, other forces at work too. But since we are discussing about that, I think if we maintain that evolutionary perspective for an readiness to change and adapt to the new environment, I think we can use this artificial intelligence. And one more idea about this is my understanding that artificial intelligence can help and enhance our mind and thinking and testing and, evaluating things and, analyzing and synthesizing, all of that. But ultimately, no machine can replace human subjectivity. That is my understanding. And that is the essence of our discussion today. We need a social sciences that acknowledge and then try to explore that subjectivity, which from a purely religious perspective, I say acknowledgement of human soul that is not just the physical or composed of elements. It is a transcendental concept. Now, we need to discover this. We need to discuss this, and we need to explore this and see how this can be redefined in terms of various disciplines in social sciences. What does it mean in economic life? What does it mean in political life? That acknowledgement of transcendence, that acknowledgement of subjectivity of human life, that principle that there is a purpose, and then human volition. This is another unique capacity that emanates from that consciousness, that emanates from that subjectivity. So we have to work on these powers and qualities when we are dealing with artificial intelligence. I've used that example before, but I'm really interested in using or giving this example. There was a movie, and it's by Stanley Kubrick in 2001 Odyssey. It's about a mission that a group of scientists go to discover what's happening in some parts of the universe. There is something unknown. There is a subjectivity in the universe, and they are aiming to discover that. But interestingly, the movie starts with some earlier human life, animal human life, or ape human type that are trying to hunt and do the basic life, and then one of them throw one of these tools, earlier tools that they had made, into the sky, and it becomes a shuttle moving into the space. To me, that is very excellent example of how technology, how the basic tool making has helped us throughout history. And of course, there is an interesting point in that movie too, because there is a computer in that journey that is trying to betray the way that it was programmed and kill the occupants of that ship, the spaceship. But anyway, this is very. I always like this example about how we can see the role of artificial intelligence.
Can I turn to a specific question which relates to what you've just said? Talking about the values and meanings and ethical frameworks and a higher transcendental purpose, where do the social sciences or the sciences get this from, and how? And I can throw a few things that I might have heard you say, or that maybe I would be asking about. One is, I have heard you say you can start with a philosophy that is not materialistic, with different assumptions. So I have heard you, I think, say that. I am in, I am concerned because when I think of the domain of values and a higher transcendental purpose, I think of the humanities. But the humanities are neither the sciences nor the social sciences, and they function on a different criteria, which is an aesthetic criteria. That is not quite the same with how science works. So creative imagination and intuition and aesthetical power are really important, but they don't prove that a certain set of values should be dominant or accepted by others. They just make things very appealing, and maybe that has a huge role to play. But it's difficult when I look at it that way to say that social science should take some of those things from the humanities, because then by what criteria do you adopt any such things? So that's part of the discussion that is complex for me. So, but the issue is how do those values come into the system? And you could also say the values might come into the system from outside the scheme of knowledge, in the sense that how does it usually work is you create a technology, the technology has bad effects, the people complain, there is a movement, social movement for or against aspects of it, and then it gets recalibrated. So now you're in the domain of policy, you're almost in that domain of what you call sciences of for an emerging world order. So it goes into government basically, and kind of that aspect of policy, the policy realm. And you could say that things can enter there. Values come from that dimension, and they come from there in a sort of, if it's in a democratic system, they come in a democratic way, but they don't come directly from social science or from the humanities. So the question I have with the whole kind of structure of knowledge and the four clusters of the curriculum is this: where do values? We know where the values come in, which is the humanities, but how do the values go anywhere else from there in a meaningful way? And I think it is also complicated by a subsequent discussion, a subset of questions within social science, which is social science paradigmatic? Is it functioning through paradigms, unifying paradigms, which would be like the Thomas Kuhn type of discussion? Or is it in fact functioning through schools of thought, which would be kind of what Popper would probably say, if I understand his ideas correctly? And there you have again a problem, because if you have different schools of thought, you're going to have different sets of values, and and there will be a diversity there that cannot be imposed over the social sciences, not to mention over technology or some other domains. That when also when I ask this question, when we ask this question, we also ask the question of, because you're talking about the humanities and science, you're also asking the question of what is the relationship between religion and science in the background. But I don't want to directly focus on that yet. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I try to be kind of straightforward about that. My understanding, in terms of expressing my own understanding, and that is, the way that we have learned about values could be, in a sense, in a smaller sense, could be explained in terms of, even when human beings were living in caves, that they had basically the most basic lifestyle. For instance, they realized values, some values based on purely materialistic needs. For instance, they realized that the ones that were more physically powerful are better fit for hunting and doing the hard work. And then there are some people who need to just be aware of what's happening in the environment, some people that need to make food, and so on. So that division of labor perhaps defined some of the earliest values. I mean, people learn that, okay, we need, this guy is bringing food, therefore we have to respect him, in a sense. And and then, of course, as humanity, social development became more complex, obviously these values also evolved and became more advanced, more complex, and so on. That's one way of looking at the way that values come into life. It's initially from the survival instinct and basic human needs. But I also would like to introduce another idea for the role of values or initiation of values in social sciences. And I know this is, let me say it this way. I think religions, by religion I mean the religion in its universal sense, religions of the West, religions of the East, Abrahamic religions, native people religions, and so on, or Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, Abrahamic religions like Judeo-Christian culture and religions, and so on. These religions, as at least the way the earliest materials and evidences and data that we have about human civilization, formation of human civilization, maybe 6,000 years ago, I don't know. These religions, in my understanding, have been the initiators and the main sources of values for human cultures and societies and lifestyle. That's my understanding. And in fact, maybe later, if we continue this discussion, we can discuss that in more details, how religions have shaped civilizations and how almost every civilization has had a spiritual foundation behind it, a core value, a system of core values. And when that system of core values has disintegrated, then we have seen the fall of civilization. So it's a very profound and sometimes controversial concept, depending on different philosophical framework. But I think, and also this is controversial in a sense that because of the role of religion in contemporary society and some of the negative experiences that people have experienced because of the superimposition of totalitarian theocracies in history, or the wars that religious differences have produced in history, and so on. So there is this negative side about religion. But let's put it this way. Religion has a source, a spirit, a soul, and a physical, social, historical existence. In other words, a religion has a spirit and then a sociopolitical construct. Sociopolitical construct, whether you are religious or not, go through history and result sometimes in positive, sometimes in negative aspects. Religions fought with each other. At the same time, churches, for instance, established universities. So we have to distinguish between this, between the source, that initial impulse of religion. Sometimes it's called wahy or revelation, metaphysical revelation. I'm referring to that universality of religion. That universality of religion, I think, is the source of values and meanings, and that has been combined with human experience that I initially explained. So as a result of this human will and human capacity to discover that basically it's all coming from the survival instinct. And then this divine revelation, these values and meanings and purposes, they come together throughout history to shape values. And so that is how I and how I see that. So some people say, people can live ethics, can have ethical life without religion, for instance, which is true in a sense. But if you have a limited lens in front of your perspective or defining your perspective, because when we say ethical life, we have to go back throughout history and the development of ethical ideas and frameworks in history. And then within that framework, discuss the role of religion, and then discuss how that ethical framework has spread out throughout history. Sometimes with a stronger impulse, sometimes with less impulse, but always present. At least, let's put it this way, a remaining residue of ethics remain in culture, even when religion is completely corrupted. And therefore, that remaining residue that people say, oh, we are following ethical principles, that is, in my judgment, is basically they are referencing that remaining residue of ethics that are left in culture. Another idea was that, let's say, with the emergence of modernity, people say that, okay, people finally liberated themselves from the domain of theology and philosophy and orthodoxies, and that resulted in progress, which is in a sense correct. Yes, that liberation from that orthodoxies, that dominated basically the Middle Ages. So when it was challenged, both in terms of theology, in terms of scientific observations, in so many ways. And then that resulted in explosion of information and knowledge, and then the age of enlightenment and reason, all these are very positive developments. And then technological outcome of that. But that doesn't, basically, if we approach that from a limited perspective, we may ignore or forget about some fundamental facts. And that is, even though sociopolitically, modernity separated itself from its predecessors, forefathers, and liberated itself, but the same values that I discussed were the force of profound changes that took place even at, with the age of enlightenment. For instance, just let me give you one example, Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, one of the greatest, thinkers and philosophers of all time. When you read about, when you see how he discusses economic issues and economic principles and economic progress, it's always on a foundation of religion and ethics. As if he assumes people will, these are taken for granted, that there is a, fear of God, for instance, or there is a concept of good and evil, that there people are, tend to help others and so on. So he assumes that there is that core foundation, and then based on that, he tries to establish a capitalist system of economic framework. So my understanding is that even though modern age separated itself from the socio-political influence of church and so on, which was very progressive, which was essential, but at the same time, we should never forget that it was still, as it is all, many times it's been said that, let's say, developments in the West was the result of the scientific progress that emerged from Athens, the civilizational construct that emerged from Rome, and the values that emerged from Jerusalem. So I really disagree with this idea that modernity completely separated itself from religion and the ideas of, supernatural or transcendental, and that was the reason for its progress. Actually, even though it's the post-modern nihilism or the alienation that we are now witnessing is also a testimony to the fact that that separation from total separation from values could not a good environment, a positive environment. And that brings us to the question of social values. And if I want to briefly say that what are basically itemize, basically, not to discuss, itemize the challenges of modern social sciences. One is over dependence on materialism or materialistic framework or philosophies that goes back to 19th century to Newtonian cosmology and so on. Lack of a unifying framework. That is a very profound, it needs lots of discussion, but basically I'm referring to basically progress or development of theories, fragmented theories, without an overarching synthesis. So again, I'm not saying that fragmentation was wrong, that was necessary, but it lacks an intellectual coherence, basically. It has created an intellectual incoherence for social sciences. The other concept is basically disregard of spiritual values and spiritual foundation of human life, that subjectivity that I discussed. And all of this, in my judgment, has resulted in not properly being able to respond to global challenges in social life, in political life, and in cultural crisis that we are seeing. And so basically, these you mentioned paradigms and Kuhn and so on. I think social sciences basically have relied on reductionist models or paradigms. Even as I mentioned earlier, ignoring advances that made in natural sciences and basically attaching to that mechanistic worldview. So attaching to those outdated assumptions has created this potential for stagnation and crisis in social sciences. So in a sense, this is how I can itemize the challenges of ignoring that dimension of values.
But you also have discussed before that some of these future changes that are needed will likely have to come from the domain of physical science. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yes. As I mentioned, it's what a new paradigm, I should say, a new paradigm of knowledge or understanding or consciousness, a new emerging epistemology requires a coherent interactions between different levels of existence, between science, between physical, between natural, between mental, emotional, social, political. We need a framework that could connect and integrate these aspects of life, existence, basically, existence together. And therefore, this is not really, I'm not trying to advance a particular political, ideological, theological orthodoxy that would run the entire show. What I'm trying to say is that there must be an integration between these different levels of existence to create a synthesis and bringing all under certain foundational values and the spirit of inquiry. Okay.
Thank you for that. Can we then talk about how religion actually comes to feature in the scheme of knowledge? Because, and this is one concern that I have, I feel that prior to the scientific revolution, religion was a major social and cultural force and political force. And as you said, they were very influential in terms of social political constructions and lifestyle, but also there was something to do with knowledge and what we would call the revelation or the sacred scriptures. And that interpretation of the sacred scriptures itself was rooted in secular philosophy or philosophy in general. I don't probably need to say secular. And so there is a constant interaction between philosophy and religious texts that produces religious understandings, which then filter through or become part of, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the time and period, of different social political constructions. And this dialogue between philosophy and religion is, in a sense, uh, it seems to me from now, looking backward, as much simpler, because the disciplines, most of the what we would discuss as the social sciences, were within the domain of philosophy. So it was a kind of a simple discussion where philosophy and theology could interact and reach conclusions that were really not in need of the measurement and testing and validation of the modern scientific paradigm, or methodology, to be more correct. Um, so I think there's a lot of I have a lot of questions about how did it work in that period, and that's a discussion to have, as you've mentioned. But the other question is, whatever that model is of how it worked then, how could that still work now, considering that the modern science, in a way, for me, changes the rules of the interaction completely, because you can't have one intellectual like Thomas Aquinas combine, I don't know, Greek philosophy with Christian thought and create a kind of scriptural philosophy based on philosophy as a mode of interpretation of the scripture rather than some other method. Uh, you just can't have that, nothing like that today. You can't. There's many religions and there's many disciplines and fields with many schools, and as you mentioned, even in social sciences, there is a lack of consensus or integration. It's the same even within the discipline of philosophy. There is no dominant philosophical school uh, that everybody sees as the most significant. There's a very this huge divergence. So those are the two questions. How did it work in the past, and then could that, how would that look in the present? Because the challenge is much greater because of the explosion of knowledge and all sorts of other dimensions. Also, the idea that religion would constitute the main social political construction and therefore in that way influence the knowledge process, that is also unlikely, in my view, to happen. So that way of arguing is not really on the map for me.
Yeah, it's it's a very profound question, and it has so many dimensions, and uh, um, perhaps I totally agree that we are living in a totally different world. Challenges that are coming from science and technology are overwhelming, and at the same time, as you mentioned, there are different religions. Even at this point, they are antagonistic towards each other sometimes. And in fact, religious intolerance is increasing, and resorting to violence is a part of, could be justified based on religion or religious value system or belief system. I mean, you just name it. So the future seems, based on what I suggested, seems kind of bleak and difficult to really combine all these things together. However, in a very rough, extremely rough interpretation, I think what we have to do, and for this, I have no other choice. I have no other choice, even though we try to discuss this issue here from a universal perspective, that not particularly from a particular religious perspective. But at this point, I have no other choice but to become more particular. And in that sense, I think what the world needs in terms of the spiritual energy, in the same way that, for instance, Christianity impacted the Roman Empire and its consequences. And the way that Christianity, and I know this is a very historically challenged, different values and different perspectives. And one understanding is that Roman Empire fell, of course, in a sense fell, but in fact, Roman Empire continued until Byzantine area, and then, of course, the Catholic Church and all of those developed. But there is one clear fact, and that is the role of Christianity, values and meanings in advancing first, moving the Roman Empire forward, and then spreading out throughout the, Western world, and then later on throughout the world. And so I'm referring to that, not necessarily the way that Catholics define the station of Christ, or the stagnation that it faced when they started selling properties in heaven, or the challenges of the Protestant movement and the order and firmness of orthodoxies and so on. All of these are not, I'm not referring to specifically. I'm talking about that primary impulse and unifying peaceful message of Christ that prevailed throughout the world and basically, in a sense, shaped civilizations. And as I mentioned earlier, impacted even when modernity separated itself from the Middle Ages and the theological domination. Still, the values remained. The value that human life of any human being is valued, must be valued. These principles became the foundation of human rights principles that became, of course, in a much more sophisticated, current, relevant to the needs of today. But the origin of this, when you trace it back, the origin of these principles goes back to that role of religion and role of Christianity and the spiritual values of Christianity that gave to human life, to human values, to human purpose, to human direction. So my understanding is that a new spiritual revolution has begun in the world with the advent of Baha'i faith and the claim of Baha'u'llah as the new messianic age. And basically by referencing, in other words, defining religion in its universal terms, my understanding is that the universal principle of the Baha'i faith will perhaps play the same role as Christianity played in terms of evolution of human civilization. At this juncture of human history, we need a universal message, such as the message of Baha'u'llah, to create or to, give that impulse, that unifying impulse because, you know, Abdul Baha, one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, wrote a letter to the people who had gathered for peace in Europe, in Hague. He wrote a letter about the importance of universal peace. And then in that says, you know, what we need today is not that war is bad, peace is good. And then he says, almost everybody agrees on this. What we need is that spiritual sentiment, that unifying power, that critical magnetic power that can bring hearts together. These words may sound kind of, you know, not really, not in a practical sense. But if you look at the world, if you look at the tension that exists in the world, we realize that there is a need for that magnifying force that could bring hearts together. Now, of course, this can be easily challenged because Christians may say, okay, we are doing that. We are continue doing that. Muslim may say the same thing and so on. But I think the universal message of Baha'u'llah somehow transcends these differences while acknowledging all these. This is one of the basic principles of the faith, acknowledging these spiritual traditions and giving a progressive dimension to the evolution of these spiritual perspectives. So it is not intended to subvert or replace any religion, but actually to reawaken the same spirit of Christianity, for instance. It is not something to replace Christianity. It is something to reawaken that spirit. So time is limited, and these are we are entering into totally. We entered in this based on this question into a totally new discourse. But this is my understanding that this new spiritual awakening may come from this source. And another perspective that I have is that these changes, these spiritual evolution, all that requires some sort of socio-political or some sort of material, social, political, economic framework, so that the flow of spirituality may enter into this framework and then move it forward towards progress rather than regress, rather than war towards peace. And I think with modern scientific developments, technological developments, and modern social progress in terms of values and institutions that we have established in the past 300-400 years, like the American Constitution or code of laws that emerge in the United Kingdom, or all of these major developments, like the greatest thinkers that shape the emergence of modern civilization, modern social institutions, modern political institutions, modern economic institutions, which we have to acknowledge that are due to emergence of this revolution of science and technology and thoughts and ideas in the West. I think, and the way that these institutions and these systems have somehow spread out throughout the world, Now that is another question that maybe feels how it's spread out, because we have like Chinese model of economic progress, but and so on, and that is different, you know. But again, we can time is limited. We cannot go into every detail. But my understanding is that this global order, even though has a lot of shortcomings, and these shortcomings are being challenged now. And I think these challenges are positive because they forced not just monolithic type of world order, but a world order that moves and opens up and expands and faces challenges and improves and so on. So that essence of world order that has been established in modern times provides us with that material foundation for the flow of new spiritual energy. In other words, we already have an emerging world order with all of its challenges that needs to undergo profound changes and even catharsis if needed. But the structure is there, and the structure needs a spirit also. That is how I can respond to your question.
Thank you.
And I think going back to social sciences, I think, just want to say that going back to social sciences, I think social sciences need to discuss these ideas, not necessarily a political thing. In other words, social sciences need to really, reevaluate some of their thinking. For instance, now let me just give you one example, a simple example, and that is the concept of critical thinking, which is very dominant now in social sciences. Depending, disregard of the discipline, they all agree on that. Okay, in a basic definition, critical thinking is about skillful process of analyzing and synthesizing and evaluating what's happening and disseminating information and so on. So it's about questioning. It's about thinking and questioning and having doubts about certain principles and ideas and then moving forward. So in a sense, it's a very, very important development that is now we can see in every social discipline. When you take a course, they emphasize critical thinking, which I have no problem with that. But I think social sciences need to also question critical thinking. In other words, approach critical thinking critically, in a sense. And one of the things that I think, one of the limitations of this extremism with regard to critical thinking is if it goes into extreme, it may face a risk of creating perpetual skepticism and perpetual relativism. Because just by constantly questioning and doubting, that may lead ultimately to cynicism, to nihilism, to paralysis of mind, basically. So that's I just want to give one example how that works. And of course, the expansion of critical thinking when it came to a particular methodology or way of thinking is critical theory. Critical theory that originated, basically, if you want to go back to history, it came from Marx, and basically it's about the question of power and oppression, and then of course in the West, after the Second World War, some scientists, some social scientists such as Marcuse and Adorno and many others, they came up with the idea of critical theory and applied it to Western environment, in terms of race, gender, and so on. So, but my understanding is that extreme attachment to these models may, in the domain of social sciences, may do a disservice to social sciences. Now, how I am suggesting this must change. We need, in social thinking and social theory, we also need a balance to combine the critique with ethical and moral commitment. That, I mean, again, for someone who's just hears this in this presentation and say, okay, how, why, but that is a different, my aim is not to go through all of these, but just mention that in critical thinking or any kind of approach to critical analysis of social forces, we need this ethical and moral commitment, such as honesty, compassion, broad-mindedness, and so on. The other thing is we need this analysis, critical analysis, to and make it or integrate it with a constructive vision. In other words, with positive alternatives. Often it is ignored in social discourse. In other words, when we say, okay, this paradigm or this policy has failed in these domains, do we have enough vision and enough positive construct to come back and say, yes, it has failed in certain areas, but it has also made progress in these areas. Let's start on the progress instead of keep doing the negative, keep rethinking and rephrasing and reframing the negative. So the other thing is, when it comes to critical thinking, is that we need to understand that there are objective realities. It's not all subjective in terms of moral values, in terms of, a lot of ideas that could be categorized under postmodernism, that everything is just imagination, everything, an individual is a human being is a universe in himself or herself, and we need to acknowledge objective realities. There are, of course, degrees of objectivity, but like scientific, there are some scientific facts, there are some historical events, there are some moral norms that are scientifically objective. The other thing is, you mentioned, for instance, creative imagination. The question is, the question is, do social sciences, in addition to critical thinking, consider, creative imagination, consider spiritual insight, and so on? Okay, so these are not like, subjects that are taboos. We need to discuss them, or investigate, or do research. Um, Another thing that is, I think, is very, very important, and that goes back to the influence of religion, spirituality, all that we discussed. And that is the essence of, creating or reawakening a sense of humility in every individual, in every dialogue, in every consultation. As long as, we have, like today, as we see in the social media, is a good example. It's just another domain, like the Roman gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. Just the point is want elimination of the other views and show off and fame and material benefits. And there is so much materialism in our environment. And those fundamental questions of humility, that life is not really worth all this fight and violence, and that the fame and progress could be easily forgotten when one passes. In one generation, nobody remembers who was active, who was inactive, who was influencer, who wasn't, and so on. That degree, that profound internal change is essential for creating a new world. And that is one area that social sciences must work on. It is not just, moral principle or something that religious people should talk about. And so as a result of that, we need to recreate that traditional purpose of education, that is, seek the truth. Seeking truth should be the primary goal of life in terms of education and learning and progress, not for anything else. So these issues need to be, I mentioned some that we need to discuss in modern in social sciences, and then the educational system that would come about as a result of these values.
Let me ask
Now,
then. Sorry, go ahead.
sure. No. You mentioned in the beginning a picture that about the 4 domains of knowledge. Maybe I can. This is a good place to discuss that. Yes. This is basically, I have worked on this on, in several other ways, and but this is one way of bringing these ideas together and discuss that in light of what we are talking about. You see, the first domain is the domain of, again, I'm using particular social sciences terminology and disciplines, and that is philosophy, theology, ethics, values. Again, these domains can be expanded. This is just a brief reference. Basically, the first domain is the domain of values, meanings. And as you see, I have intentionally separated these domains, and there is a purpose for that. And that purpose means these domains need to respect the other domains. Their job is not to go and dictate. Their job is to interact and create a dialogue, a discourse through these circles that connect these domains together, carry ideas from one domain to the next. And then the second level is the level of, or the second domain is the domain of biological and physical sciences or natural sciences. Again, all the disciplines that we just briefly referenced today. And, the domain of experimentation, testing, observation, the physical domain, and all that. And the third domain is the domain of technology and applied sciences that comes about as a result of integration, not domination. Integration of the first domain and the second domain must result in shaping technology and the progress, material progress of humanity. There is in other versions of this diagram, I have also incorporated the role of learning and basically education in this third domain. In other words, it is combination of values and meanings enhanced with scientific findings that must come to the third domain and shape the content and process of education, which results in technological outcome. Now we go to the fourth domain. The fourth domain is, I mentioned it here as an integrative domain of knowledge that incorporates the other three domains with the dynamics and parameters of the emerging world order in the areas of political economy, policy, law, organization, governance, world systems, and so on. And now I have changed that domain to some extent in later research. For instance, what I can add to this is that it is the domain that when values and scientific ideas and educational system and technological outcome come together and form the actual human civilization. In terms of ideas, in other words, this fourth domain, in a sense, is the domain where social sciences emerge and formalized and improved. Now, emerging world order, it could be emerging world civilization, emerging global policy, emerging, collective, agreements, or so again, I don't want to emphasize particular wording that may give wrong impressions. I'm talking about how social sciences, as a result of this process, and this dialogue that must happen between them. In other words, when it comes to the fourth domain, the idea is that the fourth domain, which is the culmination of the other three domains, must provide feedback to the first domain again and enhance values, enhance philosophy and theology and ethics. In other words, it's not written forever, the content of the first domain or the content of the second domain and the content of the fourth domain. The third domain. The fourth domain must create a process of dialogue and interactions and exchange of ideas and consultation, so to reinvigorate ideas in the first domain and in turn the second and turn to the third, and this must continue indefinitely. So that's basically another way of explaining what we were talking about.
That's great. Thank you. That was one of the key questions I asked at the beginning.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that would be a good way to end for now. And then, would you have any theme you would like to approach if there was a second opportunity?
Yeah, definitely. I'll let me look at the list that you sent me and I send it to you.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, all
Stuff
right,
topics, Yeah.
yeah, yeah. This is a list. So I've sent you several large themes.
Yes.
Like one
Yes,
of
yes.
them was just social sciences, and that's the one we picked on. I'm just saying that to highlight that there was no you did not know about the questions I was going to ask, so it was all impromptu answering.
Yes.
Uh, thank you for that. Thank you for your
Welcome.
patience, and I hope to do this again in the near future. Thank you.
Definitely.
Uh,
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.